I sat in the courtroom, gripping the edges of my notebook, watching the scene unfold. It wasn't my case, but as a legal assistant, I had seen enough trials to know when something was about to get interesting. And this one? It had the tension of a storm about to break. On one side of the courtroom stood Mr. Richard Calloway, a wealthy businessman in his 50s, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit. He leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence, his fingers drumming lazily against the polished table in front of him. His smirk was unmistakable, one of arrogance, of someone who believed he had already won. On the other side sat Mr. Daniel Harper, the janitor. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, his posture slightly hunched, as if carrying the weight of years of hard work. His uniform, though clean, had stains that no amount of washing could remove. His hands, rough, calloused, gripped the chair tightly. The contrast between them was striking. One had everything, the other had almost nothing. And yet here they were, in the same courtroom facing each other. Mr. Calloway let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "A janitor suing me? For what? A mop bucket he tripped over?" A few quiet laughs rippled through the courtroom. I clenched my jaw, glancing at Mr. Harper. He didn't laugh, he didn't even react. He just sat there, eyes steady, waiting. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, gave Mr. Calloway a pointed look. "I'd suggest you take this seriously, Mr. Calloway," she said. "We're here to hear the facts." He sighed, as if this was all a waste of his time. "Fine," he muttered. "I didn't know all the details yet, but something told me this wasn't just any case." And Mr. Calloway? He had no idea what was coming. The courtroom quieted as Mr. Harper's lawyer stood up. She was a younger woman, maybe in her 30s, but her presence demanded attention. She cleared her throat, then turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Harper, isn't suing for something minor," she said firmly. "He isn't here for a simple workplace accident. He's here because Mr. Calloway ruined his life." A murmur ran through the room. I sat up straighter, suddenly more invested. Ruined his life? What had happened? Mr. Calloway scoffed. "Oh please," he said, rolling his eyes. "Ruined his life? He's a janitor. What did he have to lose?" His words sent a chill through the room. I saw the judge's expression harden. The lawyer ignored him and turned to Mr. Harper. "Mr. Harper, can you tell the court what happened that night?" Mr. Harper exhaled slowly and leaned toward the microphone. His voice was deep, but there was a sadness to it, a weight that made my chest tighten. "I worked as a janitor at Calloway Enterprises for 15 years, he began. "I cleaned those offices every night. I knew every corner, every tile. I took pride in my work, even if people like him." He nodded toward Mr. Calloway. "Never noticed." I glanced at Mr. Calloway. He looked bored, checking his watch. "Then one night," Mr. Harper continued, "I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." The room fell completely silent. "What did you see, Mr. Harper?" the lawyer asked gently. Mr. Harper hesitated, then said, "I saw Mr. Calloway shredding documents, a lot of them. He didn't know I was there. I was just taking out the trash. But when I walked by his office, I saw the papers with numbers, accounts, things that didn't look right." I felt a chill run down my spine. Mr. Calloway's face darkened. "I didn't understand it at first," Mr. Harper went on. "But I knew something was wrong, so I picked up one of the shredded pieces that fell on the floor and took it home. I pieced it together that night, and when I realized what it was, I knew I had to say something." The lawyer nodded. "And what was on that paper, Mr. Harper?" He looked straight at the judge. "Proof of embezzlement." A collective gasp filled the room. Even I felt my breath hitch. I turned to Mr. Calloway. His face had gone pale. His arrogance? Gone. But it was what Mr. Harper said next that changed everything. "I reported it," he said, voice steady. "And the next day, I was fired." I could feel the tension in the room tightening like a rope pulled too tight. Mr. Harper's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The judge, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "So, you're saying that you were fired for exposing illegal activity, Mr. Harper?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied quietly. "But I didn't care about losing my job. I just wanted the truth to come out. I thought maybe someone, anyone would help me." The silence that followed was deafening, but Mr. Calloway couldn't hold his composure anymore. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice sharp and defensive. "This is absurd. The man is lying. I didn't do anything wrong. He stopped, realizing his outburst had only made things worse. The judge raised a hand, and the room fell into quiet again. "Mr. Calloway," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving him, "you are under oath. If there is anything you would like to add to your defense, now is the time." Mr. Calloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed with anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the judge interrupted him. "I think it's time we hear from the witnesses," she said, cutting him off. "Bring in the first one." A door at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man in a suit walked in. He was holding a folder, and as he stepped toward the witness stand, I recognized him. It was one of Mr. Calloway's top executives. His name was James Carter. I'd seen him in the news before, always standing beside Mr. Calloway, looking confident and clean-cut. He sat down in the witness chair and glanced nervously toward Mr. Calloway. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, "can you tell the court what you know about the documents Mr. Harper mentioned?" James hesitated for a moment before speaking. I was part of the team that handled the company's finances, and I don't know if I should be saying this, but there were a lot of transactions, strange ones, off the books." My heart pounded in my chest. "Mr. Harper was right," James continued, his voice shaking now. "We knew something was wrong, and we tried to cover it up. But Mr. Calloway," he stopped, looking down at the floor. It was clear he was afraid, maybe even guilty. The room was completely still. "I couldn't live with it anymore," James said, almost in a whisper. "So I reported everything to the authorities, and that's when Mr. Harper was fired, because he'd already spoken out. I'm sorry, I should have said something sooner." I couldn't believe it. James Carter was one of them, and yet he was now coming clean. And then, before Mr. Calloway could interrupt, the judge spoke. "Mr. Calloway," she said coldly, "you are under investigation for embezzlement and corruption. Your wealth, your empire, is built on lies, and you will answer for it." The room was completely still for a moment. Then the sound of Mr. Calloway's breath, shallow, ragged, was the only noise in the courtroom. And that's when he broke. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from tense to something far darker. Mr. Calloway, once so confident, now sat frozen in his seat, his face drained of color. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized that the world he had built was crumbling around him. His hands trembled slightly, gripping the edge of the table as though it was the only thing holding him up. I could see it in his eyes, fear. The kind of fear you only feel when you know you're caught and there's no escape. The judge didn't flinch. "Mr. Calloway," she said again, her voice unwavering, "I suggest you start telling the truth." For a moment, I thought he might try to deny it all again, that he might attempt some last-ditch defense, but instead, he lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something much darker, regret. And then he did something I wasn't prepared for. With a shaky breath, he stood up slowly, his legs barely holding him. He turned to the judge, his voice barely above a whisper. I did it," he said, his words barely audible. I've been stealing. I've been taking money from the company for years. I thought I could get away with it. But he swallowed hard. "I never thought it would come to this." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Mr. Calloway's confession wasn't met with sympathy, but with a deep, unsettling stillness. I saw Mr. Harper's face, his expression calm but full of emotion. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He was just watching, waiting for this moment to play out. The judge didn't look surprised. "I'm sure you didn't," she said coldly. "But this is what happens when the truth finally comes out. You can't hide behind your wealth, your influence, or your lies forever." Mr. Calloway's shoulders sagged further, and his voice cracked as he spoke again. I thought I could buy my way out of it. I thought I could silence people like Mr. Harper." He turned slowly, looking directly at him now. "I didn't realize how much damage I'd done until now." For a brief moment, I saw something in Mr. Harper's eyes, something soft, almost like forgiveness. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he wasn't seeking revenge. He just wanted the truth to be known. Then, with a finality that sent a chill through the room, the judge spoke. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice sharp, "you are hereby arrested for embezzlement and fraud. You will be held accountable for every penny you've stolen and every life you've ruined in the process." Mr. Calloway didn't resist. He stood there, his face expressionless, as the bailiff stepped forward to take him away. As he was led out of the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of relief and sadness. There was no joy in seeing him brought down. There was only the weight of knowing how many lives had been affected by his actions. Mr. Harper stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. As he walked toward the door, he turned briefly, his eyes meeting mine for just a second. He didn't speak, but there was something in his gaze that said everything. He had won, not through anger or bitterness, but through honesty, through the strength to stand up when it mattered most. And as he walked out, I realized something. This was never just about the money or the job. It was about doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The courtroom was still as I sat there, trying to process everything that had just happened. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of the truth. Mr. Calloway was gone, taken away in handcuffs, his world shattered. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over yet. I glanced around the courtroom, noticing the subtle shift in the energy. The tension had dissolved, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. Even the prosecutor, who had been so focused during the trial, seemed to breathe a little easier. But I couldn't help but think about Mr. Harper. He had stood there, quietly, and let the truth speak for itself. He didn't gloat. He didn't bask in the victory. All he had wanted was justice. I stood up to leave, gathering my things. I was almost out the door when I heard a voice call my name. "Excuse me, miss?" I turned and saw Mr. Harper standing at the back of the courtroom, his hands clasped together, his head slightly bowed. I walked toward him, unsure of what to expect. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere, "for not judging me." I blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" He looked up at me, his eyes tired but kind. "I know people like me aren't often taken seriously, but you didn't look at me like I was just a janitor. You saw me as a person who deserved to be heard." I didn't know what to say. It felt strange, humbling even, to be thanked for something so simple. "You're welcome," I said softly. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You know," he said, "when I first found out what Mr. Calloway was doing, I didn't know what to do. I was just a janitor. What could I possibly do to stop someone like him?" He paused, his gaze distant. "But sometimes, it's not about what you can or can't do. It's about doing what's right, even when it feels like the odds are against you." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "And now?" I asked quietly. He gave me a small, tired smile. "Now, I don't know. I never expected to end up in the spotlight. But maybe it's time I finally start living for myself. Maybe I'll take a break, rest for a while. I've earned it." I smiled back, feeling a sense of quiet admiration for him. Just as I was about to say goodbye, he hesitated and looked at me one last time. "Do you think?" He trailed off for a moment. "Do you think things would have turned out differently if I had stayed silent? If I had just kept my head down and let it all slide?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment I thought about it. "No," I finally said. "You did the right thing, and that's something no one can take away from you." He nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said again, his voice full of gratitude. I watched him turn and leave the courtroom, his back straight and steady, like a man who had finally found peace. And as I walked out of the courtroom behind him, I couldn't help but feel that his journey was far from over. It wasn't about winning in the courtroom. It was about something much deeper. A man finding his courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the consequences. The world hadn't changed overnight. But in that courtroom, for just a moment, justice had won. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story and found it meaningful. If you did, please like, comment, and share to help spread the word. It really means a lot. And if you're not subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new content. Your support makes all the difference and helps me create more stories for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below. See you in the next one.